The easiest way to lose everything is to assume nobody knows what they actually own. I heard the tires before I saw the vehicles. Gravel cracked beneath heavy sport utility vehicles rolling slowly up the long driveway toward my farmhouse just after sunrise. The smell of fresh hay drifted across the fields while a cool autumn breeze carried the sound of rustling corn stalks that my grandfather had planted on this same land more than 60 years ago. I had spent the morning repairing a wooden fence near the old red barn when 3 white vehicles stopped beside the weathered mailbox, displaying the name Walker that had never changed through 4 generations. Men stepped out carrying clipboards, followed by a woman wearing an ivory blazer whose confident stride suggested she believed the next few minutes would permanently change my life. Rebecca Collins, president of the Homeowners Association for the neighboring subdivision, smiled politely as she approached the porch where I quietly set down my hammer. Without asking permission to enter the property, she unfolded a packet of papers and held them toward me. She explained that the Homeowners Association had completed its legal review and determined my farmhouse violated multiple community requirements. According to her, the association intended to begin the process of taking control of my property because I had refused repeated compliance notices that she insisted applied to my land. I looked beyond her shoulder toward hundreds of acres of farmland glowing beneath the rising sun. The white farmhouse behind me had survived droughts, floods, and economic recessions long before the first entrance sign for her subdivision had ever been installed beside the county highway. My father was born in the upstairs bedroom overlooking those fields. My grandfather signed the original farm deed at the kitchen table that still stood inside. Every fence line, every oak tree, every weathered fence post carried a memory older than the neighborhood now trying to claim authority over it. Rebecca continued speaking confidently, explaining deadlines, penalties, hearings, and enforcement procedures while several board members photographed the farmhouse from different angles. One of them pointed toward my equipment shed and wrote notes on a clipboard as though preparing an inventory of property they already believed belonged to someone else. I listened without interrupting because experience had taught me something my grandfather repeated throughout my childhood. People reveal far more when they believe they have already won. When Rebecca finally paused, expecting an argument, I simply asked one question. Before approving all of this, did anyone verify who actually owns this land? She smiled with complete certainty and replied that their attorneys had reviewed everything necessary. Her confidence never changed. Neither did mine. I accepted the envelope, thanked her for delivering it personally, and watched the vehicles disappear down the gravel driveway until only dust remained hanging above the road. The morning became quiet again except for distant birds crossing the fields. I opened the envelope beside the porch railing and slowly read every page while sunlight warmed the old wooden boards beneath my boots. Several statements immediately caught my attention, not because they frightened me, but because they revealed how little the association truly understood about the property they believed they could seize. I folded the papers carefully, slipped them into my jacket pocket, and looked toward the distant neighborhood rising beyond the rolling hills. What Rebecca Collins did not know was that the smallest mistake in her paperwork had already set in motion a conversation that would eventually reach every homeowner living behind those decorative entrance gates. After Rebecca's vehicles disappeared beyond the hill, I carried the envelope into the farmhouse and placed it on the same oak kitchen table where my grandfather had signed the original purchase documents nearly 70 years earlier. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee, pine wood, and old leather-bound record books that had remained carefully organized inside a floor-to-ceiling cabinet since I inherited the property. I opened the envelope again, reading every page more slowly than before. The language sounded official, filled with references to compliance procedures, architectural standards, enforcement policies, and scheduled hearings. Yet every sentence rested upon one assumption that immediately stood out to me. The association treated my farmhouse as though it had always been part of their subdivision. It had never been. My family's property existed long before the first residential street, decorative entrance fountain, or neighborhood clubhouse appeared on the surrounding land. Years earlier, when developers purchased nearby acreage to build the subdivision, surveyors carefully separated our farmland from every parcel included within the homeowners association. The developers even constructed a split rail fence along the property line specifically to prevent future confusion. Over time, As new families moved into increasingly larger homes surrounding my fields, many residents naturally assumed the old farmhouse belonged to the neighborhood simply because it sat beside the same county road. Appearances, however, never changed recorded ownership. I walked into the study overlooking the western pasture and unlocked a large fire-resistant cabinet containing generations of family records. Inside rested carefully labeled binders holding deeds, surveys, easement agreements, title policies, historical photographs, tax assessments, and correspondence dating back decades. My grandfather believed paperwork deserved the same care as the land itself because memories eventually fade while properly preserved records continue telling the truth. I placed Rebecca's notice beside the original survey completed before construction of the subdivision ever began. Every boundary line matched perfectly. Every legal description remained unchanged. Every county recording confirmed that our farmhouse stood entirely outside the authority claimed by the Homeowners Association. Even more interesting, the notice repeatedly referenced financial enforcement procedures without identifying who actually held any secured interest connected to the surrounding neighborhood. That omission caught my attention immediately. I made several notes inside my legal pad before placing a quiet phone call to my longtime attorney. We had worked together for years on agricultural easements, land conservation agreements, and commercial property matters, so he already knew the history of the farm better than most people in the county. After listening carefully, he simply asked me to scan the entire packet and send it over. Less than an hour later, he called back with the same calm tone he always used when reviewing complicated property disputes. He agreed the documents contained significant assumptions that deserved careful examination before anyone responded. His advice was simple. Do not argue publicly. Do not contact the Homeowners Association. Allow every statement to remain exactly as written because documents often reveal far more than conversations. I thanked him, closed the binder, and stepped onto the front porch as the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the harvested fields. Beyond the distant tree line, I could see rooftops from the neighboring subdivision reflecting bright sunlight. Completely unaware that the paperwork delivered that morning had quietly connected two properties through a relationship far more complicated than anyone serving on the Homeowners Association board had taken the time to understand. 3 days passed without another visit from the Homeowners Association, but the silence did not last. On Thursday morning, a certified envelope arrived carrying a formal notice scheduling an enforcement hearing at the neighborhood clubhouse the following week. According to the letter, the board intended to review additional violations and consider further action concerning my farmhouse if I failed to comply with their demands. I read every page carefully before placing it beside the first notice inside the growing file on my kitchen table. The language had become more confident, almost as though the association believed repeating the same claims would somehow transform assumptions into legal facts. I never called Rebecca to argue because there was nothing to gain from debating paperwork that had already revealed its own weaknesses. Instead, I continued my normal routine. I repaired fences, inspected irrigation equipment, checked grain storage buildings, and met with local suppliers exactly as I had every season for years. Neighbors passing the farm noticed nothing unusual except an occasional certified delivery arriving at my mailbox. Inside the farmhouse, however, another set of documents slowly began taking shape. My attorney requested updated county title reports, certified boundary surveys, archived development agreements, subdivision plats, and public financing records connected to the neighborhood constructed beside my property. Every afternoon, another folder appeared inside my study until the conference table held an organized timeline stretching from the original farmland purchased decades ago to the newest correspondence delivered by the Homeowners Association. One evening, my attorney drove out to the farm carrying a thick leather briefcase. We spread maps across the old oak table while the setting sun poured through the western windows, casting long golden light across papers that had quietly preserved the history of the entire area. The earliest surveys showed my family's property standing independently long before developers purchased neighboring acreage. Later records documented utility easements, access agreements, and infrastructure improvements completed during construction of the subdivision. Then he placed another group of documents beside the surveys, records I had not requested but immediately recognized by the institutional formatting. They concerned the financing structure behind the neighborhood's residential mortgages. My attorney tapped the corner of one page without saying much, simply reminding me that complicated property disputes often involve relationships extending well beyond land ownership alone. He suggested we continue gathering information before responding because timing frequently matters as much as evidence. I agreed without asking additional questions. The following Monday, I drove past the entrance of the subdivision on my way into town. Landscaped medians, decorative stone walls, and perfectly trimmed lawns created the appearance of complete stability. Families walked along sidewalks while delivery trucks entered through the main gate, and nothing suggested the community stood at the center of a legal misunderstanding quietly expanding beneath the surface. As I waited at a nearby traffic light, I noticed the familiar logo displayed on the local branch of the neighborhood's primary mortgage bank only a few blocks away. I smiled almost instinctively before continuing toward my attorney's office, knowing that Rebecca Collins still believed this disagreement involved nothing more than an isolated farmhouse sitting beside her subdivision, when in reality the paperwork connecting both properties reached far deeper than anyone serving on the Homeowners Association board had ever imagined. The evening of the hearing arrived beneath a clear autumn sky as I drove slowly through the stone entrance of the subdivision for the first time in months. Decorative lanterns lined the boulevard leading toward the clubhouse where nearly every parking space had already been filled. Residents gathered in small groups outside the entrance, quietly discussing the rumors that had spread since the enforcement notices first appeared. Some believed the Homeowners Association was protecting neighborhood standards. Others wondered why a farmhouse standing outside the subdivision had suddenly become the center of so much attention. I carried only a slim leather portfolio while my attorney walked beside me with the same calm confidence he displayed in every legal matter we had handled together. Inside the meeting room, Rebecca Collins stood at the front beside a large presentation screen displaying aerial photographs of my farmhouse, the surrounding fields, and highlighted property lines that she insisted demonstrated the association's authority. Board members arranged thick binders across the conference table while several residents occupied the remaining chairs, curious to see how the dispute would end. Rebecca welcomed everyone before outlining the association's position in careful detail. She described architectural concerns, maintenance standards, property appearance, and what she called long overdue enforcement efforts designed to protect neighborhood value. Her presentation sounded polished, organized, and convincing until she began referring to ownership rights that she treated as settled facts rather than verified legal conclusions. When she finished, she looked directly at me and asked whether I intended to comply voluntarily or force the association to pursue additional legal remedies. I stood, thanked the board for allowing me to attend, and placed a certified copy of the original county survey on the table without making any dramatic statements. My attorney followed by providing recorded deeds, subdivision plats, historical title reports, and county filings establishing that my family's farmhouse had never been included within the Homeowners Association. Several residents leaned forward as board members quietly compared the official documents with their own presentation materials. The room grew noticeably quieter. Rebecca maintained her composure, insisting that further legal review would resolve any remaining uncertainty. My attorney simply nodded and replied that comprehensive review would indeed be appropriate because several related financial documents were still being gathered before any formal response would be submitted. That brief statement caught the attention of more than one board member. One director asked what financial documents could possibly matter in what appeared to be an ordinary property dispute. My attorney smiled politely and answered only that property ownership and community development often involve relationships extending well beyond visible boundary lines. He declined further explanation, saying the appropriate time would come soon enough. The meeting ended without any final decision, yet the confidence filling the room at the beginning had quietly disappeared. As residents filed into the parking lot beneath the cool evening air, I noticed several conversations turning away from landscaping rules and toward questions about deeds, financing, and legal authority. Driving home beneath a sky filled with bright stars, I passed the familiar neighborhood mortgage bank illuminated beside the highway. Its sign glowed steadily against the darkness while I reflected on the question Rebecca had asked earlier that evening. She believed the future of my farmhouse depended entirely upon her next move. She still had no idea that the conversation was slowly shifting toward an institution whose history had always been connected to mine in ways the entire subdivision was about to discover. 2 mornings after the hearing, my attorney invited me to his downtown office, where a single conference table had been covered with neatly organized binders instead of legal briefs alone. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the familiar skyline of our small county, including the brick building that housed the neighborhood's primary mortgage bank. He waited until I sat down before sliding a corporate ownership chart across the polished table. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary financial structure, showing holding companies, lending subsidiaries, servicing divisions, and investment entities connected through several layers of ownership. Then he pointed to the name appearing at the very top. It was the family trust my grandfather established decades earlier when our agricultural lending business expanded beyond local farms into residential financing. My father had modernized it, and after he retired, I became its managing owner. We never advertised the connection because our philosophy had always been simple. Good financial institutions should be recognized for serving customers, not for promoting the families behind them. Over the years, the organization quietly acquired regional lenders, eventually including the mortgage bank that financed a substantial portion of the homes inside Rebecca Collins's subdivision. My attorney explained that the situation had nothing to do with calling loans, threatening homeowners, or exercising influence over ordinary borrowers. Federal regulations, banking governance, and contractual obligations protected every customer's mortgage exactly as intended. That was never the issue. The issue was that the Homeowners Association had attempted to assert authority over property owned by the managing owner of the institution whose financing history had supported much of the neighborhood's original development. Their actions had triggered internal legal review because any dispute involving a principal owner required standard corporate oversight and documentation. My attorney then opened another binder containing correspondence between the subdivision's original developer, county planners, and financial institutions involved during construction years earlier. The farmhouse, surrounding acreage, and agricultural access roads had been deliberately excluded from every subdivision filing, and those exclusions appeared repeatedly throughout the financing records supporting the neighborhood's development. Rebecca's enforcement notices ignored every one of those documents. Later that afternoon, we attended a scheduled mediation session requested by the association before additional legal proceedings moved forward. Rebecca entered the room carrying fresh binders and accompanied by the association's attorney. Everyone exchanged professional greetings before my attorney calmly presented the certified ownership records, the historical financing documents, and the corporate structure identifying my role within the parent organization overseeing the neighborhood's mortgage bank. No dramatic announcement followed. No raised voices interrupted the meeting. Silence settled across the conference room as each page was reviewed one after another. Rebecca looked from the documents to me, then back to her attorney, clearly realizing that the dispute had never been as simple as enforcing neighborhood rules against an isolated farmhouse. Her attorney requested additional time to examine the records before making further statements. We agreed without hesitation because accuracy mattered far more than speed. As we gathered our binders and quietly left the building, I noticed the expression on several association representatives had completely changed. For the first time since the notices arrived at my farmhouse, confidence had given way to careful reflection, and I understood that the real conversation was only beginning because facts, once properly documented, have a remarkable way of changing every assumption built before them. During the following week, the Homeowners Association suspended every enforcement deadline, while its legal counsel reviewed the documents presented during mediation. From my perspective, nothing changed at the farmhouse. The field still needed attention before winter, livestock fences required inspection after several windy days, and the old tractor demanded its usual maintenance before the next harvest season. The rhythm of the farm remained steady because the land had always taught my family that lasting results come from patience rather than urgency. Meanwhile, my attorney continued receiving courteous requests for additional documentation from the association's legal team. We provided every publicly recorded deed, certified survey, financing agreement connected to the original subdivision development, and corporate ownership record requested through the proper legal process. Every response remained factual, organized, and complete. There was no advantage in surprising anyone when the documents already spoke clearly for themselves. Several days later, my attorney informed me that the parent company's legal compliance department had opened a standard internal review, That procedure was routine whenever litigation or threatened litigation involved a principal owner connected to one of the organization's affiliated institutions. The review focused entirely on governance, documentation, and risk management. It did not affect homeowners, their mortgages, monthly payments, or ordinary banking services in any way. Existing loan agreements remained exactly as they had always been because customers deserved stability regardless of unrelated legal disputes. Instead, the review examined historical development records, original financing packages, subdivision disclosures, and correspondence exchanged during construction of the neighborhood years earlier. As those files were assembled, an unexpected pattern emerged. Multiple references confirmed that the original developer had repeatedly acknowledged the independent ownership of my family's farmland and specifically excluded it from every subdivision covenant, financing exhibit, and recorded plat. Those exclusions appeared consistently across engineering reports, title commitments, lending documents, and county filings. The Homeowners Association's recent enforcement notices had overlooked each of those records despite their availability through ordinary due diligence. A second mediation session was scheduled soon afterward. This time, the atmosphere inside the conference room felt noticeably different. Rebecca Collins entered quietly, accompanied by two additional board members who spent far more time reviewing documents than making statements. Their attorney thanked us for providing complete records and acknowledged that several important historical filings had not been considered before the original enforcement action began. My attorney responded professionally, emphasizing that everyone benefits when decisions are based upon verified documentation instead of assumptions. The conversation gradually shifted away from alleged violations and toward improving communication between the association, county officials, and neighboring property owners. Before the meeting concluded, the association's attorney requested additional time to recommend corrective actions to the board. Rebecca looked across the table and admitted that the association had relied too heavily on incomplete information during its initial review. It was the first moment since this entire dispute began that certainty gave way to careful reflection. Walking back toward my truck beneath the cool afternoon sky, I noticed the neighborhood beyond the conference center looked exactly as it always had. Children rode bicycles along quiet sidewalks, families tended flower beds, and delivery trucks followed their normal routes. None of those residents had ever been my opponents. They simply expected the people making important decisions on their behalf to understand the facts before acting. Standing there for a moment, I realized that the strongest form of authority is not the ability to pressure others. It is the willingness to pause, verify the truth, and let properly documented facts guide every decision that follows. As autumn gave way to early winter, the Homeowners Association called a special board meeting that attracted more residents than any gathering in recent memory. The dispute that had begun with enforcement notices aimed at my farmhouse had quietly become a conversation about leadership, due diligence, and responsibility. I attended only because the association's attorney requested my presence after completing the legal review. My attorney joined me carrying the same organized binders that had accompanied every meeting from the beginning. Nothing inside them had changed because the facts had never changed. The meeting room felt noticeably different from the first hearing several weeks earlier. There were no enlarged photographs of my farmhouse displayed on presentation boards, no confident summaries describing alleged violations, and no discussion about enforcement timelines. Instead, copies of certified county surveys, historical subdivision plats, title reports, and development agreements rested neatly before every board member. Rebecca Collins opened the meeting with a calm tone that reflected careful reflection rather than certainty. She acknowledged that the association's original review had relied upon incomplete information and confirmed that additional legal research established my family's farmhouse had never been subject to the governing documents of the Homeowners Association. Several residents asked thoughtful questions about how such an important mistake could have occurred despite public records being available for review. The association's attorney explained that assumptions made during previous leadership transitions had gradually replaced direct verification, allowing inaccurate information to continue without anyone comparing it against the original recorded documents. He emphasized that no single document caused the misunderstanding. Instead, multiple small assumptions accumulated over time until they eventually appeared to be accepted facts. My attorney responded by thanking the board for conducting a complete review rather than defending an incorrect position simply to avoid embarrassment. He reminded everyone that responsible organizations build credibility by correcting mistakes once reliable evidence becomes available. That statement seemed to resonate throughout the room. Residents nodded quietly, while several board members reviewed the surveys one final time. The conversation gradually shifted toward preventing similar situations in the future. New procedures were proposed requiring certified title verification, county record confirmation, and independent legal review before any future enforcement action involving neighboring properties could move forward. The recommendations received broad support because everyone recognized that accurate documentation protects homeowners, associations, and communities alike. Rebecca then looked toward me and offered a sincere acknowledgement that the farmhouse and surrounding farmland represented an important part of the area's history long before the subdivision existed. She admitted that the board had become so focused on expanding neighborhood authority that it had overlooked the simple responsibility of confirming where that authority actually ended. I appreciated her honesty because meaningful accountability rarely begins with dramatic speeches. It begins when someone chooses facts over pride. As the meeting concluded, residents gathered around the historical surveys with genuine curiosity, comparing old maps to the familiar streets where they now lived. Many were surprised to discover how carefully the original developers had preserved the boundaries separating the farm from the neighborhood. Walking outside beneath the cool evening sky, I looked across the distant fields where the farmhouse lights glowed warmly against the horizon. Nothing about the land had changed throughout the dispute. The fences remained where my grandfather built them. The fields continued following the seasons, and the farmhouse stood exactly where generations of my family had always known it belonged. The only thing that had truly changed was that everyone else finally understood it as well. Several weeks after the special board meeting, the Homeowners Association formally delivered a written resolution withdrawing every enforcement notice connected to my farmhouse and acknowledging that the property had never been subject to its governing authority. My attorney reviewed the final agreement carefully before recommending that I sign the mutual resolution closing the matter completely. There was no reason to prolong a dispute that accurate documentation had already resolved. The signed copies joined generations of family records inside the fire-resistant cabinet in my study, becoming another chapter in the long history of the farm. Winter settled quietly across the fields as frosty mornings covered the pastures with a thin layer of silver that disappeared beneath the afternoon sun. Daily life returned to its familiar rhythm. I repaired equipment, planned spring planting schedules, inspected livestock shelters, and continued managing the farmland exactly as my family always had. Beyond the tree line, the neighboring subdivision also began moving forward. The association adopted new policies requiring certified title verification, independent legal review, and direct consultation with county records before initiating enforcement involving neighboring properties. Those procedural changes received broad support from residents because everyone understood how easily assumptions could become expensive mistakes when left unchallenged. One afternoon, Rebecca requested a brief meeting at the farmhouse. She arrived alone without board members, attorneys, or official documents beyond a single folder containing the association's updated policies. Standing beside the old split-rail fence separating the farm from the subdivision, she admitted that the experience had changed the way she viewed leadership. She explained that protecting a community required more than enforcing rules. It required understanding where authority began, where it ended, and how responsibility depended upon careful verification rather than confidence alone. I appreciated her willingness to have that conversation because meaningful progress rarely comes from winning an argument. It comes from learning something valuable enough to prevent the same mistake from happening again. Before leaving, she asked whether I would consider participating in a future community workshop explaining local property history and the importance of county records during neighborhood planning. I accepted without hesitation. Several months later, residents gathered inside the community clubhouse where historical surveys, subdivision plats, agricultural maps, and development records were displayed along long tables. My attorney, county survey officials, and planning representatives joined the discussion, explaining how careful documentation protects everyone regardless of which side of a property line they live on. Families asked thoughtful questions while longtime residents shared stories about the area's farming history before the subdivision existed. Looking around the room, I realized the dispute had accomplished something none of us expected. Instead of creating permanent division, it encouraged a stronger understanding of the land that connected every home surrounding the old farmhouse. As the meeting concluded and I drove back across the quiet fields beneath the fading evening light, I passed the neighborhood mortgage bank standing peacefully beside the highway exactly as it always had. Its familiar sign reminded me that true strength is rarely found in titles, influence, or appearances. It is found in responsibility, preparation, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing the facts long before anyone else thinks to ask the right questions. 1 year later, the farmhouse stood exactly where it had always stood, surrounded by fields turning golden beneath another autumn sunrise. The weathered porch still overlooked the same split-rail fence, the same rows of corn, and the same gravel driveway where Rebecca Collins had first arrived, believing my family home could be brought under the authority of an organization that had never possessed legal jurisdiction over it. Walking across the porch with a fresh cup of coffee, I paused beside the old oak table where every document connected to the dispute had been carefully preserved alongside deeds signed by my grandfather decades earlier. Nothing had been discarded because every generation leaves behind more than land. It leaves behind proof, responsibility, and lessons worth remembering. The Homeowners Association continued operating under its revised policies, requiring independent title verification, certified surveys, county record confirmation, and legal review before any enforcement action could proceed. Residents often told me those changes increased confidence rather than creating unnecessary bureaucracy because everyone understood that accurate records protected homeowners, board members, and neighboring landowners alike. Rebecca remained active within the community, no longer driven by assumptions but by careful preparation. Whenever new development proposals reached the board, she insisted every property boundary, easement, and recorded agreement be verified before a single decision moved forward. Watching that change unfold reminded me that genuine accountability is measured by what people choose to do after discovering they were mistaken. My own life changed very little. I still repaired fences before winter storms arrived, still inspected barns after heavy rain, and still walked the fields at sunrise just as my father and grandfather had done before me. The parent company overseeing the neighborhood's mortgage bank continued serving families throughout the region exactly as it always had. The institution never became a weapon, never influenced homeowners unfairly, and never changed the terms of anyone's mortgage because that had never been the purpose of revealing the truth. The hidden connection simply reminded everyone that authority often extends beyond appearances, and wise decisions begin by understanding relationships that are not immediately visible. Late one afternoon, I drove past the subdivision entrance and noticed children riding bicycles beneath trees that had begun changing color for the season. Families waved as they worked in their gardens, and several neighbors smiled when they recognized my truck. There was no lingering hostility because the conflict had never truly belonged to ordinary residents. It belonged to incomplete information that had quietly accumulated over time until someone finally compared assumption with fact. Before returning home, I stopped beside the hill overlooking both the farmhouse and the neighborhood beyond it. From that single viewpoint, I could see the old family fields stretching across the valley while the subdivision rested peacefully beside them, each occupying the land that had always belonged to it. The distance between them had never changed. Only people's understanding had. As the last light settled across the countryside, I realized my grandfather had been right all along. Land remembers every boundary, documents remember every promise, and truth never needs to hurry because it eventually arrives exactly where it belongs. I climbed back into my truck and headed home beneath the fading evening sky, knowing the farmhouse would remain in my family for another generation, not because of hidden influence or financial power, but because preparation, integrity, patience, and the quiet strength of documented truth will always outlast the loudest claim made without them.